Good evening, and thank you everybody for coming back to join us for our third installment of 5 in the Dead Sea Scrolls course. Just a real quick recap on where we've been and where we're going. So in our first session, we talked about the theme of discovery, both in terms of how the scrolls were lost and how they were found. And then last week, during the Thanksgiving week, we talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Bible, and how the Bible, how we can learn about the Bible through the Dead Sea Scrolls, and how we can learn about the Dead Sea Scroll community through their use of the Bible. So just to recap, our first 2 sessions have come and gone on discovering the scrolls and on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Bible. This session will deal with, we're going to dig into the community that we think produced the scrolls. We're going to learn about them from the point of view of history, from the point of view of the archaeological remains that they left behind, and what that tells us about the community. And then we'll look at some of the texts in the scrolls themselves that deal with the subject of community. So there are, just as there are scrolls about the Bible, there are scrolls about the community. And so that will be kind of the way that we'll wrap up today. And then in our final 2 sessions, as I mentioned before, next week we will deal with kind of the religious beliefs of the Qumran community, the community that gave us the scrolls, and what that tells us about how ancient Judaism in general, and in particular Judaism in the early Roman period, the time period that the scrolls come from, right at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. And then our last session will deal with all the modern controversies surrounding the scroll: mysteries, secrets, lies, thefts, forgeries, and the debates that have raged for the last 75 years or so. But in today's session, as I said, we're going to focus on the people at Qumran and the community that they formed. And so I've broken this up into 3 kind of sections tonight. The first is what history tells us about the Essenes as a community, a religious community, a community with very particular ideas about how to live Judaism, and how to interact with the law, and even how to interact with the state and other Jewish groups. And then we'll study a little bit about the Essene hypothesis as well, because it is a hypothesis that the Essene community produced the scrolls, but it is a very strong hypothesis. I will say a little bit about other hypotheses just to be complete on that, because not everybody agrees that this is the case, but most people think that this community is the community responsible for the scrolls. The second part will shift to looking at the site itself, again in a little bit more detail, but with a focus on the remains that tell us both about the kind of community that lived there and how they lived as a community. And then finally, we'll look at the community rules from the Qumran community. So there are 3 scrolls that deal with the subject of community. There's also other, bits and pieces here, but these ones are ones that tell us about how they think they should live, how they govern themselves, how they became part of the community, and those sorts of things. But first, I want to talk about this group called Essenes, and what do we mean by Essenes and the Essene hypothesis. So I'll just state the hypothesis to start with. So the Essenes, we think it comes from the same root that gives us like the modern word sneus, meaning like pious or observant or pure. And that's the best explanation anybody can come up with. We're really not quite sure where the term comes from, but they are identified by both Jewish and Christian historians of the Roman period who wrote in that period as one of the 3 major groups of Jewish believers, or one of the 3 denominations or sects, or however you want to think of them, in Second Temple Judaism within the land of Israel. And we know that from multiple ancient sources. At least 5 like reliable historical sources talk about the Essenes. And additionally, a couple of sources actually place them at Qumran. So we know that the group that when we talk about the group called the Essenes, we are probably talking about their location at Qumran as well. And there's a range of geographic, archaeological, and scientific connections between the scrolls, the jars, and the caves. And some of the caves are only maybe 300 feet or so from the monastery. Yes, sir. You're on mute.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I already have a question.
Yep.
Because you said major Jewish groups, and I remember in previous lecture you said there are 100 people, about 150 people at Qumran. So I'm trying to understand what the definition of major is.
Yeah, so this is where the historical sources are a little bit conflicting. So Philo tells us that there are thousands of Essenes, and that they live in every major town. And then there's a second century or third century Christian historian called Hippolytus, who tells us about the different sects of Essenes. And so we think that this is maybe more like a headquarters or an elite group of Essenes who are living here. There's another theory that is is just being published now, that this might be like a festival site or a pilgrimage site as well. I'll talk just very briefly about that at the end. Yeah, so you're right. You're very right to notice right away that there is a distinction between major and a very, very small group here. And so we're making a couple of connections. We're making the connection between this larger movement and this site. That site is obviously a site of significance for this group, but we don't think that they all live there. And when I get all the way to the end and we talk about community rules, you'll see that we have two sets of rules. One for a community that seems to treat marriage and having children as the norm, and then another group that seems to live like a monastic lifestyle. And so we imagine this to be like Egyptian or Syrian or even Roman early Christian groups, where there may be monks, or like religious orders of celibates, but that most people aren't like that. That may be a way to think about them. There's a lot of debate about this. But yeah, sorry to get a little sidetracked, but that's a great question right away to notice the difference between people talking about a big group and this kind of small individual site. But anyway, so there's definitely strong connections. There are some reasons to doubt some of these connections too. I will get to those in just a couple slides. And they have to do with other theories that also make some sense. But what's hard to get away from, and the reason why a lot of sensible scholarship points towards this community just is because of the geographic proximity. It's really too close in time and place and to be probably anything else. But then there are also theological, like religious beliefs, and sociological, like organizational connections between the Essenes as they're described in history and some of the manuscripts that we have from Qumran, from the caves. So that's the Essene hypothesis. If you ever hear somebody talk about the Essene hypothesis, the hypothesis is basically that the Essenes is the sect within Judaism that is responsible for the scrolls. There are a couple of other theories. Probably the most compelling alternate theory is that the scrolls are somehow transported manuscripts from the temple itself, from around the time of its destruction. And there are some reasons to think that that's a sensible hypothesis. One is that we know that there is a shift in the organized Jewish community, the community that's resisting Rome, from Jerusalem into the north, into Galilee, and into the Judean Desert around the Dead Sea and Masada during the time that the scrolls were probably deposited. And so it's not totally beyond the realm of possibility that that could be the case. Additionally, the size of this library is so large, thousands of manuscripts, that some people think that um, uh, it that it more sensibly represents, or it's a better explanation for it could be that it's the library of a major city or major cult site, like the Jerusalem temple site, that this is like too big of a library to just be in this one weird little place. I'll show some pictures from that we didn't look at before about how scrolls were maybe made that I think counteracts that a little bit. Some other couple of theories about how this may have happened. Some people early on and suggested that this could be a Geniza, which is like a depository for discarded manuscripts or discarded scrolls that are of. Sometimes people like want to bury Torah scrolls, or if they have the name of God written on them, or for other reasons, people deposit old manuscripts in places to be discarded. And that some of the explanation for why we have some very dissident or sectarian or heretical, if you even want to use that term, ideas about ancient Judaism included in these scrolls might be that these were texts of a group that was not, the people didn't agree with them and they were kind of discarding them. So that's a theory that sometimes gets put forward as well. There are other maybe less sensible theories as well. One is that this is a sect of Mandeans or Mandaeans, are a Gnostic type group of Jews that are influenced by beliefs in the Persian world. There's some interesting data there, but maybe not enough to really argue that this is somehow that scrolls themselves are under the influence of anything but Second Temple Judaism. Early on, because of some similar language to and themes to the New Testament, some people thought that this was a group either of Christians or of a community that the Christian community grew out of, that somehow maybe Jesus and John the Baptist were Essenes. At the right moment in this presentation tonight, I'll offer some reasons why I think that's probably not the case. But if you were to go visit the site at Qumran and watch the movie that the Israel Antiquities Authority has made, the movie, it's like the movie for the visitor center will persuade you that John the Baptist was an Essene. I remain unpersuaded both by the movie and by the scholarship, but that is certainly something that a lot of people talked about early on. And the reason why we're moving away from those ideas is that we're finding out that a lot of the ideas, the beliefs in the New Testament, like the Messiah, or division between sons of darkness and sons of light, or a general resurrection of the dead in the last days. These are like serious theological concerns within the New Testament that are also found in the scrolls. We think that that's actually, that the reason is because those views were actually held widely in Second Temple Judaism, not just, and it's just because lots of people believe in those things. There's not necessarily a genealogical relationship between the Essene community of the scrolls and the Jesus movement or the John the Baptist movement. But those are all other ideas that people have, and I don't want to dismiss them entirely. I think I come from an archaeological background, and I'm persuaded by the archaeology that the Essene hypothesis makes sense, but there is a big minority of scholars that hold to these other views as well, particularly the transported library theory. That's a very widely held theory within scholarship. I just want to say a little bit about the Essenes again, as the historians know them, or in this case, the philosopher Philo, a Jewish philosopher from Alexandria. Yep, Beth?
Yeah, is it possible that it could be both the temple library and a group of, let's say, maybe not the Essenes, but a group of people who would be responsible for taking care of these?
It certainly could be, yeah. And I mean, you're right to point out that a lot of these hypotheses assume that there's a single origin or nexus for all the manuscripts, right? But the reality is, like, if we just know the world of books, you know, if we can analogize from the world of books in modern times, that's not the case, right? So I may have books on my desk that are discards from the Brandeis University Library. And then I might have other books that I bought on Amazon. And I might have other books that are checked out of a BU library or something like that. So it's possible that they're, you know, scrolls can move, they're portable objects. They're goods that can be sold even, right? So they could have multiple origins. And one idea that I would keep an open mind about is the possibility that I'm going to tell you the story of how we think the Essenes came to be. One possibility is that they actually brought scrolls with them from Jerusalem at a different time, that these belong to the community when the community was the Jerusalem temple, that the same people might have controlled the Jerusalem temple at a different point in history. And when they left, think like the Republicans and Democrats, like when people leave office, they, you know, I don't know, I want to like this, people take documents with them. That's the front page of the New York
Well,
Times today.
I was thinking,
You know, they may have done a Donald Trump and taken some things from the temple with them.
well,
as
I was
well.
thinking more in
Yeah.
terms of, you know, they may have been in communication with the priests, and the priests knew that there was danger.
Yeah, I mean, and you're absolutely right. And you know, some of the best evidence that we have for that is in the Masada complex where they fought the Romans. Some of the Essenes are there, and they took scrolls with them there. So it's totally believable that Essenes would go to Masada and take scrolls with them. That people from Jerusalem could have taken scrolls to the Dead Sea region as well. So it's definitely a believable hypothesis. And you're right to point out that they don't all have to come from the same place. Yeah. So just coming back to the Essenes themselves for a second, just to explore what we think this group is. So this is from the Hellenistic Jewish philosopher Philo. He lives in Alexandria in Egypt, not too far from the Dead Sea, but in a different country. And he describes them, the way that he describes them is as of a particularly pious sect. So these are people that in their conception of the Torah are more observant than other Jewish groups of, you know, their version of the precepts of the law. So they follow the law very strictly. And that they are also seem to be highly devoted to cultivating a personal practice of holiness and purity. And I don't just mean cultivating an ethical life. That's all Jewish groups, by and large, in the early Roman period, are very concerned with the ethical life. And the rabbis in particular are concerned with an ethical society as well. The Jesus community is concerned with like an equitable society in terms of sharing, you know, and justice and those things. So these are ideas that are floating around, but this community is focused specifically on what in religious studies we would call holiness and purity. So they really are about creating a separate world where they live like even their actions in their daily life implicate like a certain kind of holiness and separation from corruption and impurity in a religious sense. And so that is the part of the phenomenon of the Essenes. Another part of the phenomenon of the Essenes is that they do seem to be reclusive, at least in the way that Philo describes them. They separate from the world. Think like a community like the Amish, or even some ultra-Orthodox communities are like this as well, where like their solution to their dissatisfaction with sinfulness in the world is to separate and to be by themselves in another place. And that is pretty much every historian that talks to us about the Essenes tells us this about them. So Philo tells us about it, Pliny tells us about it, Josephus tells us about it, Hippolytus tells us about it. So all of these historians who are writing not in a totally different world, but when they want to tell you three things about the Essenes, they will tell you this is kind of the thing that they want you to know about them, that they are very focused on piety and purity, and that they are kind of withdrawn from the rest of the Jewish world. And the other thing that Philo tells us is about this, for some Essenes, this communitarian lifestyle, and where they share goods in common, they may live in common housing, they may just redistribute wealth from members of the community to other members of the community, and that they also live a common public life where they eat meals together, they study scripture together, and they practice kind of community rituals together. And that's, so they may even have like similar dress, and so again, think about a closed community. Now, one of the things that, as somebody was very quick to point out at the beginning, one of the things that we don't always know with these historians is whether they are describing the group at Qumran, or they are describing this broader movement of the Essenes, because it seems like some people are describing a group that really looks like a monks or a withdrawn separatist religious community, and some are describing more a generalized kind of piety. And I think that will make sense. We can make sense that the best explanation for that is that there are both, that there are people that are kind of in both orbits. Yes, sir.
So what was their connection to the temple in Jerusalem? I mean, if you were aligned with the temple in Jerusalem, you were doing sacrifices there, you were doing pilgrimages there, you were tithing there. And this was part of the tension with the Pharisees already. What was going on with these guys?
I'm about to get there now. The answer is that they were thrown out. And so they were once in control of it, and they were thrown out. And it's a little bit of a mystery exactly when that happens, whether it happens right on the boundary from the transition from the Maccabeans to the Herodians, or at some other time. But I will explain, give a little bit of background on the community in just a second, that will shed some light on that. Actually, it's the very next slide. So what we think, and this is our best hypothesis, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit just for the amount of time that we have, but the best hypothesis is that the core of the community began as a priestly group within the Zadokite, the Zadokim, the Sadducees, that controlled the Hasmonean temple infrastructure. So the Hasmoneans, or the Maccabees, are like that set of Jewish rulers in the second and early first centuries BC, and before the Idumean Herod becomes king in the place of them. And so it seems like at one point they were the temple, like they had control, or at least they were part of the apparatus that controlled the Jerusalem temple, like the actual day-to-day functioning. We don't know whether the character that I'm going to describe to you in a minute is called the teacher of righteousness. We don't know if he was a high priest. A lot of people think he was a high priest, and then a lot of people think he might have just been some minor religious official that led a group of people away. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a second. But one thing that the literature does tell us, both the historians and the scrolls themselves tell us, is that there's some kind of falling out between the Jerusalem temple and this community, such that they don't participate in it at all anymore. So the Pharisees will still pay their temple tax, and they'll bring their free will offerings and their sin offerings and that sort of thing. Even the Jesus movement visits the temple and has some participation in the temple complex. And obviously the Sadducees, we believe, control the temple complex in this time period. But the Essenes they run away. They have nothing to do with it after a certain point in history that we can't quite nail down. Their own story of the origins of the group seems to suggest that they wandered around in the wilderness for some time before being, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes here, exiled to Damascus. And it was once thought that that was meant to be a literal Damascus, like the capital of Syria. But now a lot of people believe that when they are referring to Damascus, they're making kind of an inside scriptural reference to a prophecy in the book of Hosea, and that they actually mean they are calling Qumran Damascus. That's the current theory, at least among a lot of the scroll scholars, is that when they say that they wandered the wilderness for 30 years until they went into exile in the desert beyond Damascus, what they mean is the community that they established at Qumran. Now that is a little bit of a circular logic, right? Because we know that they end up there, and so we're making a circular argument there, but it's still a sensible argument. Another thing that we know from the historians is that the early Essenes, including a guy named Menachem, who is a Essene prophet, he's called a prophet in Josephus, was friendly with Herod. And so another, one of the ideas that we have is that they might be being thrown out of the temple on the boundary of when Herod takes over. And maybe they were initially in control of it, and then they had a falling out, and they ended up going into exile. There's another theory, which I'll get to in a minute, that has to do with the calendar, which is also very interesting. But there is a character frequently referred to in the community's literature, the literature of the scrolls, and in one document that we have from outside of Qumran called the Damascus document, that talks about this person called the teacher of righteousness. And when early Christian scholars found the scrolls in the 40s and 50s, they thought for sure teacher of righteousness, Jesus. But it turns out when you look at the details, it's not very close at all to Jesus. This is somebody who probably was a priest in the temple complex. He was, like I just said, he possibly a high priest connected with the end of the Hasmonean and the beginning of the Herodian dynasty. And that the community thought that the appearance of the teacher of righteousness, he kind of comes on the scene early in the life of the community, but not right at its beginning. They take the emergence of the teacher of righteousness to mean that the present age is about to come to an end, and that he is not the Messiah, but his activity is a sign that the Messiah is about to come. And that's an idea that the Christians will take up with John the Baptist as well. They also think that John the Baptist is a figure that is the new Elijah, who will be the person that precedes the Messiah. So this teacher of righteousness, we think the best evidence or best hypothesis is that he's a priest from the temple, either the high priest, or maybe there's other characters that are called like the lieutenant high priest that seem to be more in charge of the day-to-day. He could be somebody like that. But somebody that has enough clout to have a religious following of his own, but ends up on the outs with the Jerusalem temple complex. And then his enemy is somebody called the wicked priest. And we know the wicked priest is a high priest. The literature tells us that he is a high priest, but we don't know which high priest they mean. A lot of the high priests, they were political appointees and very kind of violent, almost, terroristic, regimes. And so they weren't always like the nicest, most pious, most observant people came to the office of the high priest. So like it was often like the warlord's younger brother kind of thing was the high priest. And so it's easy to imagine a scenario where a particularly pious or particularly observant religious group within the temple infrastructure could suddenly be in conflict with a politically appointed high priest. But there's a couple of cases in Jewish history where this could be. One is the high priest Jonathan, and then another one named Antigonus or Antigonus. He's actually both a king and a high priest at the end of the Herodian period. He might be the wicked priest. But actually, there's a scholar named Groningen at University of Leiden that has put forth a hypothesis that a lot of us are coming around to now, that the high priest may be a composite character. Kind of like Herod in the New Testament is a little bit of a composite, like between Herod and his son. It's not always clear which one they mean. And so it may be the same thing here. When they talk about the wicked priest, it may be that they may be making a composite of a couple of different characters from slightly different time periods in history, the beginning of the first century, the end of the first century, etc. That when they mean the wicked priest. But there is a moment where the wicked priest attacks the teacher of righteousness on the Day of Atonement and expels him from the temple complex. That's a story that the Qumran community tells in a couple of different documents. And so that's why we think that they were part of the temple before. But they get expelled. And this thing about the Day of Atonement is really interesting, because normally, like if you read the Mishnah or just kind of use your imagination, the high priest should be like super busy on the Day of Atonement and not, there's an animal sacrifice that's going on. They have to choose between the two goats to make the scapegoat, and he changes his clothes a bunch of times. I'm not trying to trivialize. I'm just saying it's like a busy day for the high priest. And so the idea that the high priest would like go and smack somebody across the face or, some kind of an assault on the Day of Atonement has puzzled scholars a little bit. And I actually think that we have an explanation as to how this happened, which I'll get to in a second. But the high priest, the wicked priest, is also kind of regarded as a liar or a teacher of false doctrine. And that could be as simple as they don't agree on one point of Jewish law, or it could be that there's like a philosophical revolution that's happened within the order of the temple system at this time. So we don't know a whole lot, because much of what we know about the temple, how the temple worked, comes from earlier and later. We know it from the Bible, and then we know it again from the rabbis. The rabbis are close in time after the temple is gone, but we're hearing only the Pharisees' point of view with the rabbis. But one of the fascinating things that there's whole communities of scholars that study this calendar that they have. The Essenes and the Qumran community and the Qumran and the scrolls all have a 364-day calendar. And this is a picture on the right-hand side of a sundial from Qumran that's demarked into 364 days. And then they also left us calendrical texts that tell us how to interpret the calendar and how to divide time into different periods. This seems to be somewhat of a mystical or cosmological interpretation that they have about time. The 364-day calendar is much more it's like a purer calendar, a calendar that's like more logical, more symmetrical, more rational than the 365 and a quarter days that it actually takes the Earth to go around the sun. It also matches with some of their other ideas. So it divides evenly into 7. So every Sabbath and every festival in a 364-day calendar will fall on the same day of the week. And you don't have this problem of moving a festival because of the Sabbath and those sorts of things. It also divides evenly into the 24 courses of priestly and Levite service in the temple. So there's just 24 different groups. They double the number of 12 tribes. and they each have their turn of service. Like they each would get an equal turn in this kind of calendar. The problem is that astronomically, it just doesn't work. Even in like 100 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls, everybody in the Western world knows from Pythagoras and Hero of Alexandria and some of these scientists, everybody knows that the Earth goes around the sun exactly 365.25 days. That's already known, like in like this time period. And so for somebody to come and say in first century Israel that we need to switch to a 364-day calendar is almost as strange as if we were saying today. It's really not like they didn't know how long the year was. The rabbis actually had fairly complicated methodologies for computing the days of festivals, knowing about leap years and leap months and all kinds of stuff that they did to produce a calendar. So anyway, this leaves us with the interesting questions about the group.
Can you hold up a second?
Yeah, for sure.
I lost you. I don't know what 24 courses of priestly families are.
Yeah, so the temple.
I mean, a course to me is in school, so I don't know what you mean.
These are like successions of groups of people whose job it is to do the temple worship on a given day. So the problem is, as time goes on, Aaron has a lot of grandchildren and, et cetera, et cetera. And so there starts to be lots of people who are eligible for this temple priestly service in the temple. And so at some point in history, they kind of come up with a system where there's 24 families and they each take turns being the priestly families that are responsible for all the jobs that are in the temple. So putting out the bread, lighting the menorah, cleaning the altar, taking the ashes off the altar, sacrificing the animals, butchering the animals, bringing the wood. These are all jobs that people do in the temple every day, collecting the money. So that's that sort of thing. So each of them has a turn.
And the Essenes still did animal sacrifice? I thought earlier you said in a previous session you said no.
The Essenes don't do anything with the temple after they're thrown out of it, but they still imagine an ideal temple. Like they still imagine like when how things are going to be when they are in charge again, if that makes sense. So they're not ethically opposed to animal sacrifice. They're just kicked out of the premises for doing it, if that makes sense.
But they're not doing animal sacrifice.
They are not. No, okay. They're not. Some people thought that they might be, but I don't believe they are. Aaron?
This may be a nit, but 364 is not evenly divisible by 12. What did they think it was? Does this matter? If it doesn't matter,
I don't know if you're right. I mean, so there's that would be 4 extra days in that, right?
If it doesn't matter, forget it. But if it's really important, then you got a problem.
I will get an answer for you guys on that next time because yeah, there is something going on there with the calendar, but I will 365 is also not divisible by 12, but I will maybe there's 4 days or something where they do something else. Yes, Beth. Beth, you're on mute.
I read the calendar, and if I remember, they do something to resync every year. They do something with those extra days. They were aware that their 364-day calendar didn't actually match with the sun calendar because you would have gotten out of sync very quickly. So if I recall, they do have some kind of like, sort of like the what the Romans did with the Saturnalia. They just they have some
add some days.
Yeah, they just add some days.
But anyway, so that we're all have to get better at calendar math here. But the hypothesis that the Second Temple scholars take away from this is that it may be possible that they were observing the Day of Atonement when in their calendar when it was not everyone else's Day of Atonement, and that this may have been the offense that led to the community's separation. And also that if they felt that the temple was not performing services on the correct days anymore, or the festivals weren't being done on the correct days, they also probably wouldn't have participated in temple worship. But this is a little bit sketchier of a hypothesis than some of the other. This is on less solid ground than simply the fact of the Essenes or the way that they're organized as a community, if that makes sense. So we'll put the calendar aside for a second and switch over and just start talking about the community or the physical, configuration of the community, so that we can have some understanding of that and maybe look at some texts. Yeah, so just to reorient ourselves to the site of Qumran here. This is actually a modern aerial photograph, so you can see the visitor center and some of the other features here. It's from Google Earth. So the actual ancient complex of Qumran is right here, just outside of you. This is where you would go in and park and watch the movie and that kind of thing. Up hill, there is an aqueduct that once connected to the Wadi Qumran. The Wadi Qumran is a seasonal waterway. The Dead Sea area doesn't get very much rain. So the way that they get water is they channel, when they have these months like flash floods, they channel all that water into these big pools, and that becomes kind of their day-to-day source for water. And there's a couple of large cisterns and other bathing complexes at Qumran that I'll talk about. And then the caves are right here. So including some of the caves where many of the scrolls were found are, again, you can see this distance here from the road up to the site is maybe only a quarter of a mile. So the cave complex itself is, again, maybe only a quarter of a mile to half a mile away from the actual monastery, as I will continue to call it, somewhat anachronistically. This is a picture of it today, well, a couple of years ago anyway. What's left of it, you can see the tower complex and the remains of some of the outer buildings. And then this is the plain of the Dead Sea and the Dead Sea beyond it here. And then you can see across the sea into the other side, into Jordan. It's not a completely barren wasteland. It definitely feels that way in some senses, but these date palms grow, and there is a small amount of water. So it's enough to sustain hundreds of people. It's not enough really to build a city without significant Roman water engineering, which is not present at the site. But it is definitely, a place where people can and do live over an extended period of time. This is an artist's conception of the complex as it was occupied in the later stage of its occupation. But it's not an imaginary rendering. This is quite closely follows the architecture, the remains of the architecture that is present here. And so if you've ever been to the site, or if you ever do visit the site, the visitor center is over here, and you walk into through the tower. So you're not coming in through their entrance into the site, but it's kind of their entrance is a little bit over here. Within the site, there are a couple of key structures. We can see the tower, which is like for protection and defense, and maybe some storage as well. There's these long buildings over here that seem to be used for community functions, community dining, and also for prayer. And then also we have an interesting bathing complex over here, and it's maybe a mikveh complex. I'll show a picture of one of the pools from the mikveh and talk at that time about how we think that they did ritual bathing. But in terms of the community room, one of the things that really tells us that this is probably a community of people that are living in common is in what we call the pantry. We call the pantry because we found a huge number of identical dishes, plates, and cups. And the ceramics in these plates and cups actually does match the ceramic for the jars. So they came from the same pottery that produces the jars that the scrolls are in, also produces the dishes that they eat off of here. But there's like hundreds of plates and dozens to hundreds of cups found. And so it seems like that's more in line, like if you've ever been on a kibbutz and they have a lot of dishes because they feed a lot of people. It's the same thing here. This is not, it's like more like a community dining room than it would be individual residences. I've actually been part of excavations, long-term excavation of a farmstead with 5 families in northern Israel. And this is not what we see at all in family living. Each family typically in this period will have their own dishes of all different kinds, dishes that they bought at markets, dishes that they bought from traders that came from overseas, and they all just have like an eclectic collection of belongings in their own homes. This is like a community that they have a bunch, like a bunch of dishes that I don't know if you guys think dishes are as cool as I do, but this is definitely like one of the markers that people are eating their meals in common, at least some of the time, maybe every meal in common. So then there's this other room that is called the scriptorium. And this is architecturally also interesting. It has a stove in it, which you may say, why would you ever need a stove at the Dead Sea? It's never cold enough to like need a stove, but we think it has something to do with the way that they're prepared manuscripts or ink or something. But this is another quite large room that has what we think is seating around the outside of it. They found dozens of lamps in this room, even though it's just like a big room. It has dozens and dozens of these identical Roman oil lamps. This is showing one here with the wick still in it. And what they would do is they would just use olive oil and plant fiber wick, probably palm fiber wick, and they just light it and it burns the oil down. The oil goes up the wick, and they throw these lamps away when they're like almost like light bulbs or whatever. They're a disposable entity that exists in very, very, very large quantities everywhere in the Roman period. But here in this room, they found a lot of them. And some people have connected this with a text in the community rule, which I'm going to hopefully get to in a little bit, that talks about them spending a third of every night reading to one another in the community room. And so that's, again, it's a kind of a little bit of a circular argument, but people think that this room might have been used for nighttime reading of the scriptures. The other thing that we know is it was used for writing the scriptures. And we have these 3 fabulous writing desks that were found there. They're pictured here on the right-hand side, and this is an artist's drawing of them. With the bench here, you can imagine the bench where the 2 scrolls are sitting here is this bench that's right here. The floor is not fully excavated, but that they're sitting at these 3 big writing desks. The writing desks are not at Qumran anymore. They were in the Rockefeller Museum. This is a picture of them in the Rockefeller Museum in the 60s. I don't know if they're still in the Rockefeller Museum or if they're in Israel Museum now. I can't remember, but they were carted away to a museum. But this is them, and so we think that they sat on the benches and they kind of prepared the scrolls. The other thing that I mentioned last time is that we found lots of, well, not we, but archaeologists found lots of inkwells, these little pots. Some of them are ceramic and some of them are metal that were used to actually, dip in the pen in to get the ink out. And like something like a third of all the inkwells in antiquity were found in this room. So it's like, there's definitely like some big time scroll production going on in this room. And then I've just put pictures of some pottery over there on the right-hand side. These are all found at Qumran as well. And then this is a picture here of a structure that archaeologists are interpreting as a mikveh. And then on the other side of the wall, there may be just a regular water storage tank as well. Why do we think it's a mikveh? Well, it definitely has steps that people are meant to walk down. And what's really interesting that is totally not necessary in other types of cisterns is this kind of ridge separation between the two sides. And it's hypothesized that maybe you go down one side and come back the other clean. I don't know how, if I'm 100% confident with that, but it does seem to be the case. Texts tell us that the Qumran community practiced ritual bathing for purity every day. That they would, especially that they would, the elite members of the community would immerse themselves every day. And this is actually where one of the reasons why I think the John the Baptist and Jesus movement and the Essene movement aren't very closely related to each other. The Essenes seem to be opposed to exactly what John the Baptist and Jesus are in favor of, which is like a one-time baptism in the Jordan River or in another kind of living body of water where you're delivered from your sins. But at the same time, they're what we call antinomian. They're like not really concerned with like following other aspects of the Jewish law. Jesus and his, at least the Jesus that we hear about from the Gospels, is very like indifferent or even like somewhat negatively valenced towards other aspects of the law, like washing pitchers and bowls and keeping meat separate from milk, and like these kinds of even they often accuse him of violating the Sabbath, and which is like a interpretation of the law that all Jews share in this period. So, but Jesus seems to be very indifferent or even negative about this purity law, but favors this kind of one-time baptism to put your sins away. The Qumran community is the exact opposite. They are very against this idea of like a one-time baptism that will let you out of your sins, but they're very into the observance of these daily ritual practices. And so that's why I think John the Baptist, even no matter what the movie says at Qumran, he's probably not coming out of this community, or if he is, he's completely changed his mind about these ideas. So they definitely, the people in this community are doing mikveh every day as a way of kind of enhancing their sense of individual purity. So I want to talk about just one more set of finds from the community, and that is skeletons. I had some pictures of skeletons, but I didn't know if everybody wanted to look at skeletons, so I took them out. But I have some pictures of the grave sites over here on the right-hand side. The other thing that's interesting that makes us think that this is a celibate male community of people who are living apart is the way that they do burials is totally different. I'll show what typical burials in the area look like on the next slide. But everybody who's buried in the cemetery at Qumran, and there are 33 skeletons that have been unearthed, everybody is buried equally spaced in single graves with no grave goods. And every skeleton, at least according to Yossi Nagar, who did the recent paleoanthropology on them in 2016, 2017, they're all male, and they're all adult males between the ages of 20 and 65. So that is the configuration of the cemetery, and they're almost all buried in this north-south configuration, with a few that are off. Like, I don't know why that guy is buried sideways, but that's the configuration of the cemetery. By standards of the day, totally weird. When we look at how burials work just 7 kilometers away at Jericho, these are, almost everybody is buried in family tombs. And the text, the New Testament, Josephus, these things tell us also about family tombs. And they all kind of work the same way. They have these, they're carved into the rock or in natural caves. They cut individual cells, we call them loculi, to lay people out on shelves. Sometimes if they want to reuse the loculi over time, they'll after grandpa his time has kind of come and gone, they'll collect up his bones and they'll put them in a box, which we call an ossuary. These are a bunch of ossuaries from Jerusalem. This drawing has both ossuaries and human interments from Jericho over on the bottom. So this is how cemeteries work in the Roman period. Like if you're part of a family, the family owns a tomb. The tomb is like property, and you use it as a family, and everybody is in there. And there are women in tombs, and there are children in tombs, and there are grave goods in tombs. The Jews of this period don't hesitate to bury the dead with lamps and coins and even amulets and sorts of things. There are like, they're semi-kosher compared to like some of the pagan practices, but they do burials with objects. The Qumran people, there's nothing in the grave. It's not even a rock kind of thing in the grave. So again, quite different from the rest of the surrounding area. And so all of this, when taken together, is one reason why archaeologists read the site of Qumran not only as a place of production of the scrolls, but as a place that belongs to a celibate male community whose lifestyle is probably living out these texts, reading them in community day and night, and also living a life of prayer and prophecy and contact with angels, which we'll have to wait for next time. I didn't bring those texts for today. Yep, Alice. I saw a hand.
Yeah, I was wondering, why do you think they were celibate? Is that a Jewish tradition? I don't think of that as being part of the Jewish tradition.
I mean, it's something that I would think the Jews of this period would have some discomfort with. It's not completely unknown. So there's another community of Jews, Alexandrian Jews in Egypt, called the Therapeutae, who are also celibate. We think it may be a purity thing. It may be like that they think they're living in the last days. They're separating from the world. So they're also separating from like the sins of the flesh or the corruptions of the flesh of being, euphemistic after the manner of, sexual euphemisms. But that they may think that contact with women, contact with sexuality, which has its own ritual practice, right? So there are laws about the male body, laws about the woman's body, and in terms of purity. They may be trying to avoid those things. That's the best guess that I can give you, but it's definitely not. It's definitely weird. Like it's not something that's commonplace. Although the early Christian community also has a complex relationship with this, because on the one hand, we think that John the Baptist and Jesus were celibate. That's what the texts tell us, but their followers weren't. We hear about both male and female followers of Jesus in the earliest days who have wives and children and mother-in-laws and all those sorts of things. So yeah, it's definitely unusual. I hope that answers the question. And we don't know exactly why. I want to finish up by spending a little bit of time with the rule books at Qumran. There are 3 texts that are of this genre that we call, I'm sorry, 2 hands. Yeah. Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that Andy was raising his hand.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't see it. Andy?
Hi. This doesn't have to be answered right away, but a bunch of us are doing Daf Yomi, and the rabbis often talked about their opponents, the Sadducees, even the hated Samaritans. But 3 years in, I don't remember seeing anything about the Essenes. Although I just did some Googling and I found out that there's one reference to a Menachem who had an argument with a rabbi. But I wonder whether the Essenes were so way out there and so hated that the rabbis didn't want to discuss them at all.
Yeah, it really is interesting, and it raises interesting questions for what is the locus of these debates. Because in the New Testament as well, and I keep going to the New Testament because I'm more, first of all, it's a great source for all this stuff, but also I'm more familiar with some of the materials than I am with the historical sources. But the New Testament, the Christian community, neither Jesus nor Paul ever argues with the Essenes either. They have debates with the Sadducees, they have debates with the Pharisees, which they name by name. They have debates with the people that they call the teachers of the law. They have debates with the Herodians, but they never debate the Essenes. And in the Mishnah, I don't think that the Essenes are ever mentioned in the Mishnah either, that they're never like, there's like, they're not part of the debates between Hillel and Shammai. They're not part of they're never quoted, even as you mentioned, like the Samaritans, the Kutim, as they're sometimes called, and then also the Minim which the heretics, we think they're talking about Christians. Those are mentioned even in the Mishnah, and Essenes are never mentioned. But the historians all know about the Essenes. So it's very strange. Yeah, you're right that the religious communities don't, and maybe they are a little bit of a mystery. Maybe nobody knows what they think.
Well, maybe, is it possible that they were sort of a small group, sort of like the Amish, right? They were a small group, but they were kind of weird and out there, so the historians would record them because they were weird and out there, but the regular...
Yeah, I mean, this requires a little bit of historical interpretation, and now I'm just guessing. But there's several authors, Josephus, Pliny, Hippolytus, they all say there are three kinds of Jews: Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. And then Josephus will sometimes, he'll refer to other groups, including James, the brother of Jesus, in one case, and they all refer to the Samaritans. They all know about the Samaritans too. They don't consider the Samaritans Jews, but they know that they are like Jews in some ways. But it seems weird that it's like everybody recites off this one-liner of there's three groups that you need to know about, A, B, and C, and the Essenes are always C. But you're right that the religious polemics, the religious literature never talks about them until we find their own writings. Yeah, it's a great question, and a little bit of an unsolved mystery. And I will, on my very last slide, hopefully I will have time to get to my last slide. I talk about where do we think they went, and I'll give you a couple of hypotheses of where we think they went. Obviously, they didn't all disappear in one cataclysmic event. So I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. But back to the subject of like rules and the organization of the community. They left us 3 rule books at Qumran. And then there's another rule book called the Damascus document, or sometimes called the Cairo-Damascus document, that is known from outside of from the site at Qumran, but is also found at Qumran. And so that is also a little bit of a mystery, because like, is this the rule for this community? If so, why is it in the Cairo-Genisa from the Middle Ages? But the 3 kind of ones that are found at Qumran are what is called the community rule, sometimes called the manual of discipline, the Serach HaYachad in Hebrew. And then that is kind of the main community rule. I'll show just a couple of examples of passages from that in a minute. And then another shorter rule called the rule of the congregation, or the charter for Israel in the last days, 1QSA. And then a very fragmentary text called the rule of the blessing, or the priestly blessing for the last days. The big difference between the community rule and the rule of the congregation, or the charter for Israel in the last days, is that the top one seems to envision some kind of a monastic community of celibates all living together and sharing everything. And the second one seems to be written for people who are marrying and raising children, but still living some kind of life of set apart purity. So interesting in that respect, that there's like 2 rules that don't 100% agree with each other, and they differ quite a bit on the development of a family and that sort of thing. So I'll show just a couple of examples. But before I do that, I just want to say a little bit about the Cairo Geniza. So this is a room in the ancient synagogue in the modern day city of Cairo, which is the ancient city of Cairo as well. And there's been a continuous Jewish presence in Cairo from very, very early antiquity, and probably from the Persian period, maybe even before the Persian period. There was the Jews in Cairo, and they had a synagogue from Hellenistic times onward. An Oxford scholar named Solomon Schechter, at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, he went to Cairo and he went to the storeroom and he started rummaging around, and he found some manuscripts of great antiquity in this Cairo Geniza. And one of the manuscripts that he found and was translated and published was this thing we call the Damascus document. And it talks about some of the things that the Essenes talk about, like being exiled beyond Damascus, and about these rules that they have. And so one of the greatest mysteries of the community is, how did this document that seems like it originated in the lost community of the Essenes, maybe even at Qumran, end up in a synagogue in Egypt in the Middle Ages? So it's a little bit of a mystery, and it's many people are trying to solve that mystery. If you have any clues, I'll offer a tip line at the end. But it's definitely an interesting thing that there's like one text about that we kind of know from other sources besides the scrolls themselves. So to this community rule, the rule for the monastery, I put up just a couple of examples of text here. It describes in great detail the process by which somebody becomes initiated into the community. And these initiation process includes both like a confession of one's sins and kind of doing these, giving up possessions and doing purity type things, immersing in a mikvah and changing one's clothes and that sort of thing. But I saw a hand real quick. Was there a question?
Yeah.
Yep.
I seem to remember that there were like 4 or 5 people from Masada who escaped and may have ended up in Egypt. So maybe
I'm not sure. I don't know about the Egypt. I mean, it's totally believable. I thought some of the people who escaped from Masada were women, for sure. I think there's a famous story about women who escaped.
Yeah.
Obviously, somebody lives to tell the tale too. So I think maybe not everybody committed suicide at Masada. Maybe some people did. Maybe some people had already left Masada before the siege was over.
Josephus, if I remember, tells the tale of talking to a woman who had escaped.
Yeah, and I think if the Josephus tale, I think has 2 women that escaped, if I remember correctly. But I'm reaching in my memory on that. But these things almost are never, they're idealized to some extent. So the real politics may have been messier. There may have been people who hid. There may have been people who surrendered to the Romans. So we don't know for sure. But one of the other mysteries is, like, if some of these historians are right and there are Essenes in other towns, they too might have transmitted some of these ideas because they weren't present at Qumran when Qumran kind of collapsed and they moved to Masada, and then they were part of the final stand, if that makes sense. Yeah, but just come back to the idea of the community here. So they do a lot to be initiated into the community, and then the community also imposes a lot of rules on them. I'll show some rules in a second. But they are sort of making a profession, as one would think of monks making a profession, like a lifelong commitment to a community, or we talked about, we keep going to the Amish this evening. You know, when you become an adult in the Amish community and you undergo baptism, usually immediately before you get married, there's also like a confession and a kind of a commitment to live the lifestyle of the community. So we see in some of these more ascetic and more purity-oriented communities, also a kind of a sense of a life profession, where they make a contract or make a vow to join the community, and this is elaborated in great detail in the community rule. The community rule also provides a list of punishments for members of the community, and you know, usually you write law for the offenses that are actually being committed. It's not always the case, but often the case, in the bylaws deal with the issues that the community is likely to encounter. These are not laws concerning murder or you know, violence, or they're all laws that involve orderliness in the public life of the community. So if you insult your companion, then you have to do penance for 1 year and be excluded. If you deliberately deceive your companion, I assume companion here means another member of the community, then you might have to do penance for 3 months. If you're careless with the property of the community causing its loss, then you might have to pay it back. But then we get to like the more like really telling us that they're living like a life in where they are together every day. If you fall asleep in the assembly of the congregation, then as many as 3 times, then you might have to do 30 days penance, or if you leave the assembly, then you might have to do penance for 10 days. These are punishments that we would love to have in a college classroom. Emily, a colleague of mine, and I were joking today about the kid that we pass the attendance sheet to at the beginning of every lecture is usually asleep about half the time. So so you can imagine that they are living a life where they're all in a room together, they're dining together, they're staying up late reading Torah together, and they might be falling asleep, or they might be just getting up and using the bathroom too many times, or these kinds of offenses against the orderliness of a very, very pious community that takes these communal worship practices very, very seriously. And so, and also you can notice it's a very kind of a docile and polite community towards one another. You can be singled out for punishment, even for like shaking your finger at somebody or raising a voice at somebody. You might be kicked out of lunch for a year and have to do penance if you wag your finger at somebody or swear at somebody, or these sorts of very, very minor infractions that this rule book is concerned with. And so where we see rules like this typically is in monasteries. Yep, Aaron.
Yeah, are all these rules in addition, or what's their relationship to some of the basic Jewish tenets, like the covenant and circumcision as the symbol of the covenant with God?
They are definitely practicing all of those things, because they take a very high view of circumcision, the rules of bodily purity. We also, I didn't show pictures, but we also have stone vessels and other implements of food purity law. We think that they are, and also some of the historians tell us they're very, very choosy about their food. Some of them won't even have social relations with Jews from the towns, because they are concerned about impurity that might be contacted from people who aren't observant about contact with corpses, or with Gentiles, or eating Gentile food or meat that sacrifice animals. These are all things that are legitimate concerns in the Judean region, because they're sharing the region with Greeks and Romans, and with Jews of various levels of observance. And so we definitely think that they have some version of piety. They may not have all the oral Torah rules that the rabbis give us, where the Sadducees seem to have slightly like less of a fence around the Torah than the Pharisees or the rabbis, later rabbis do. But they are, if it's a law in Leviticus, a law in Deuteronomy, they are probably doing it.
Well, this is several hundred years before the Talmud, so.
Yeah, it's only maybe 110, 120 years before the Mishnah.
Right,
though.
right. I was saying
So-
it was still before the Mishnah, but the Mishnah
Yeah.
was forming.
Yeah. So, but the Mishnah is we think the Mishnah is from the Pharisees by and large. The Mishnah always agrees with the Pharisees. Well, it doesn't always agree with them, but he generally agrees with the Pharisees on theological points, which is why we think it's probably from them. But yeah, you're right to point out that they may be different kinds of Torah observance in this time period, because the Mishnah and the Talmud give us something. It's at a different time. They probably are not having anything to do with the temple complex, though. So if there's a law that says that you have to tithe to the temple your grain, or there's a law that says you have to bring a bird offering, or these sorts of things, they're probably not doing any of that kind of Torah observance, even though the temple is still functioning.
But it's interesting that they're already breaking away from its worship rather than temple sacrifice. So they've already kind of made that.
Yeah, they don't even participate in other ways. We think from there's a scroll called the Temple Scroll that we'll talk a little bit about next week that tells us what they think of the temple, and they don't think that the Jerusalem temple is what they want to participate in. I want to flip over for a second to this other rule, just with the last couple of minutes that we have together. And this is a rule called I call it the Charter for Israel in the Last Days. This is another text. It's found at Qumran. It has Qumran style language in it about the sons of Zadok and the men of the covenant, who are people that we think are internal names that the Essenes use to refer to themselves. Much in the way, let's say, the Mormon community in the United States refer to themselves as Latter-day Saints. I think the Essenes may have these own names for them. Professor Jonathan Klawans at BU, a colleague of Dr. Lior and I's, he has actually written an article about what the Essenes call themselves. That is interesting, but I won't get into it here. But this rule is a rule that involves raising families, which is quite different from the rules of the monastery. And so it has a whole series of life stages for young men. It doesn't say as much about young women. The sequence of stages that a young man would go through to become initiated into the Essene version of Judaism. And so from the age of 10, they teach, or for 10 years, they teach them the laws of the covenant and the principles of the community and their judgments. So the community's theological views and legal views, as well as the laws of Moses. And I've always read this 10 years they will come as children, and then they talk about 21 years to mean that around the age of 10 or 11 is when they're talking about beginning to receive formal schooling, and that they'll receive formal schooling in Torah until they turn 21 years old. And they don't marry until the age of 20. And then they do marry. It says, that they are allowed to marry after the age of maybe 20 or 21. And then from the age of 25 on, then they take some kind of role in this community. And the charter actually is like a lot of interesting things about what the different age groups do in their roles in the community. And then as they get older, they acquire additional leadership in the community, and they have different duties that they perform in the community. Some of those duties, we're a little bit of an eschatological kind of an end times kind of situation for this rule, though, because they're also talking about these young men beginning their service as priests at a particular age. But we know they are not sending anybody to Jerusalem to be a priest. So this is like maybe a rule that it may even be imaginary a little bit, that they are they think the young men will at a certain age be in the priestly duties in their conception of the world, or the conception of Israel after they regain authority, and not in the present age that they're living in. Yeah, and so it, like the monastic community, though, it also suggests that people are laboring kind of in common for the benefit of the whole community. Ellis, I saw a hand, I think.
What does what's the meaning of the last days? I mean, this document doesn't sound like they're expecting imminent end to the world, because they're talking about
I
children.
think if I remember correctly, yes. So that the words "final days," I think Yomim Acharim is in the text. So it actually begins with those words.
But it doesn't. What does it mean, though? Do you think?
I think from other scrolls, and this is like, again, interpreting, because as several folks have pointed out, we don't know if these all come from the same time and place. But in other scrolls, they have like a scroll called, we call a war scroll, that talks about a war between the sons of darkness and the sons of light that's going to happen in the last days. And also some of their biblical interpretation, like their interpretation of the book of Habakkuk and their interpretation of the book of Isaiah, also tell us that they think that they're living in last days. But they're just like it seems like that's again like a common belief that we're living in the end times during this period. It's also other Jewish groups, including the Jesus movement, think that they are also living at the end of history.
Well, given that they were living under the brutal Roman occupation, that's not an unreasonable thing to think.
Yeah, and also that, I mean, the temple gets destroyed and people get sold into slavery and thousands of people die. It is a rough time. It is not, I mean, they're living in a very difficult time. But more specifically to your question, the phrase Yomim Acharim, or something to that effect, I could look it up in a second, does appear at the beginning of the text itself. Yeah, so just real quick so we can get to the end. Yeah, it also talks about the service at the table. And so they seem to have a common table, and they are dining together, and they have rules for dining at the table. So even though they have husbands and wives, they are still living, at least imagined that they are living in some kind of a communal situation in this particular version of the charter. So the last thing that I want to talk about is just with just a few minutes that we have left. What do we think happened to the Essene? So in my first session, I suggested to you that manuscript evidence from Qumran might suggest that some of the Essenes went to Qumran, or maybe even all of them went from Qumran, went to Masada, where the Romans laid siege in the 70 of the Common Era, and that we know from Josephus and other sources, Roman sources, that they were like eventually the citadel was captured and everyone was killed. So we think that the monastic community may have met their end there, with the idea that they may have interpreted the events of the Jewish war as signs of the end times, and that they started to live out the violent end of the last days with other Jewish communities that were united in that war. There are other potential ways that Essenes could go. One of the mysteries that we have is I keep talking about this Roman historian named Hippolytus, Christian historian from the early 3rd century. He seems to think that the Essenes lasted longer. Like in his version of the history, they don't just go away at the end of the Jewish war. And then they also, some of the texts tell us that they lived in other communities as well. They might have lived in Jerusalem. They might have lived in the cities of the north. They might have lived in Beersheba or some of the other prominent cities in the south, Ashkelon, those sorts of places. And so they might have survived in other places. And so there's a little bit of evidence that they might have, their ideas may have continued to be transmitted in certain other Jewish communities. One idea that has been suggested has been the Karaites. The Karaites are a Jewish community that still has a small living community, both in the United States and Israel today. But they do not keep the Pharisaic form of the oral Torah, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Talmud, the way that many Jewish communities from the rabbinic tradition do. Some of their Lawrence Schiffman at NYU has suggested that some of their theological beliefs line up with the beliefs that are found in some of the scrolls. So maybe there's some connection there between the Karaites and the Qumran community. There's another community called the Mandians. These are community that ends up in other parts of the Levant, like Iraq. Yep, Aaron.
Just quickly, I take it all these theories have to explain the fact that you know for sure that Qumran was abandoned suddenly all at once by everybody.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
So we don't have evidence with the next people to use that site are Bedouins in the Islamic period. Yeah, doesn't seem to be a reoccupation of the site. The site is destroyed in an earthquake before the Common Era and is restored. But after 67 to 70 of the Common Era, it does not look like people went back.
But my point is that there's no evidence that it was just a celibate community that died out because it was celibate.
No,
Okay.
does not appear to be the case.
Roman soldiers would have gone by on the way down to Masada.
They did, and they probably did some of the damage to the site that we know of. But people had enough time to hide the scrolls over a large landscape. So I don't know if they knew the Romans were coming or if they read the times and seasons. But they are kind of lost to some extent to later on in history. So there's also two other theories that continue to recur are that they may have become part of either Gnostic Jewish sects. We know of some Gnostic groups, some groups that practice a form of Judaism oriented around secret knowledge, secret spiritual knowledge. And then also there are Christian communities that are like that as well. And so some people have hypothesized that they may have their ideas may have been transmitted in those communities as well. But they do kind of just disappear off the map. And as several folks have pointed out, it doesn't seem like the rabbis, even rabbis from the Mishnah and the earliest Midrash, which are authentically early 3rd century, don't have any memory of them. They don't seem to be like overly concerned with them. So it's a little bit of a mystery what became of them. And I think we're right at time. I can stick around for a couple questions, but that's what I've had for tonight. Yep, Aaron.
I have one other question. Are the people who are studying the scrolls themselves, can they tell the difference between scrolls that are originally written and those that are actually been restored? So maybe there are scrolls, we don't, I imagine sometimes scrolls were restored. Somebody,
Oh yeah, we do have scribal emendations in different handwriting. Yes. I am not as much of an expert on the paleography that's what we call the study of ancient writing itself. I had a significant part of one class that I took at Brandeis on the paleography of the scrolls, but I'm not an expert on those things. Scholars who are experts, and there are only a handful of them, Ada Yardeni, Christopher Ralston, some two kind of major names in that area. They do think that they can tell those things. not everybody, like, we don't, the rest of us don't know enough to know whether to believe them all the time. You know?
So, 'cause
It's like a
I'm-
very, very specialized practice to know those things.
Because I'm wondering how many of the thousands of scrolls that they have found there, have evidence of that and might not have been written there originally at all.
I don't know. If you're interested in those questions, the paleographical questions, I could do a little digging and maybe try to work it into one of the later presentations for a slide or two. Maybe next week or in the final week when we talk about controversies. We could talk
Yeah.
about controversies with the manuscripts as well.
I remember
These same people are also the people that determine real from fake, which is why they come up in the controversies.
Well, I also remember there is definitely evidence that the scrolls cover a period of time of about 300 or 400 years. So.
Yeah, the earliest ones are quite old. There may be 300 BCE.
Right.
And then the latest ones are Greek stuff that's from right around the end of the destruction of the site. So that would be roughly 350 years or so.
Yeah.
The earliest one is, I think, Paleolithic. That's a really old scroll. They might have swiped that from the temple when they left.
Right. So that
but-
would strengthen the argument that at least some of these came from
Yeah.
the temple.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting argument. I mean, what size of a library should we expect for a community like this, and what has to be a library from an urban setting? It's a great question, and then of what antiquity? Like you said, if the Paleo-Hebrew Leviticus is authentically, and it's also on gazelle skin, which none of the rest of the stuff is authentically that super old. It predates the community, right? They weren't the original possessors of it. That was written for somebody else somewhere else.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you guys, and we'll
Very
see
interesting.
you next week with Angels and Demons.
All right, look forward to it. Thank you.
All right, take care, guys.
Thank you.